G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here on the 9th of May 2021. Looking back 79 years to the events of the 9th of May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea, as recounted by Jack Rennel, Distinguished Flying Medal, AEA, who points out that he lived and fought alongside men the like of whom he shall never meet again. I consider that he was what they call a modest sort of a cove, because it's not until you get into about page 27 of the book that one realises that Jack Rennel, he was on A2412, the Catalina that fought with Zeros, out over Deboyne Island and then made it back to Cairns. We'll get into that. And I'm still trying to figure out how Jack Rennel's book came via Arthur Lunnon's widow, Mrs. Vera Lunnon, came via a Mrs. F. Dan, who subscribed to the RAAF Wings magazine and left her magazine cover in the book, along with newspaper clippings. And an order form for the book, which comes equipped with handwritten autographed dedication to Una Dan, as well as a sticker proclaiming it to be the property of Mrs. Una Dan, 111 Right Close, Tuncurry, 2428. Well, that's about 250 miles southeast and about 3,600 feet down the mountain at the mouth of the Manning River. So how Jack Rennel's book comes to be in Badger's bookshop for me to be buying, on impulse, I saw it. I thought, oh, RAAF Catalinas, I better get a hold of that because my father's cousin flew Catalinas. But my father's cousin, Alan Wharton, he flew Catalinas out of Broome in 1944 and 1945, because he spent 1943 flying Lancasters out of England, and in 1942 he was probably doing his basic training, or perhaps operational training. In early 1942, when the Battle of the Coral Sea was getting ready to happen, and I have no idea what Alan Wharton was doing in May 1942. However, going by Jack Rennel's abstraction, taken from the unit history sheet and the operations record book, we have a pretty good account, taken up a reasonable amount of print of what went on for aircraft A2412 flown by Bill Miller and A. Lunnon. As you've probably figured out, I'm making these videos technically unscripted. I'm shooting them in sequence, so they're effectively edited in camera. If there's a moderately okay blooper, I'll leave the blooper in there because it means reshooting the whole thing to get rid of a blooper because I have no editing facilities. Today's game plan is that I will attempt to interpret the latitudes and longitudes and the official description of today's mission using the same old dividers and mapping pins and Reader's Digest Atlas of the World. In an earlier video, I've already read a letter from Bill Miller, captain of the A2412, where he made a bit of a reference, kind of cryptic, to his radio operator passing him a message from base asking him to go out and find an aircraft carrier after he'd just fought off an attack by Zeros. At the time, I hadn't sort of reread and wallowed in the narrative sufficiently to understand what he was on about. However, as I mentioned earlier, on page 27, we have about half a page concerning A2412 and 79 years ago today. So I plan on reading that. Following which I'm going to commit some YouTube piracy once again, and I will treat you to my potato camera's view of my touchscreen phone's view of Indiana Nidell on World War II channel and their coverage of the Battle of the Coral Sea, because they have much better production facilities and much better access to computerized resources than anything I can come up with. And to be honest, their animated graphics of what went on the day is so far in advance of anything I can try to come up with by interpreting the maps and the narrative and the map references that I've got, that I think the cleverest thing I can do is attribute the use of the footage to them and suggest that anybody who likes watching my pirated version of their work should go and subscribe and watch the video unadulterated without having to look at it through an air foggy interface on their channel. Cairns, 9th of May 1942, aircraft A2412, event O, chart number 1, which is there. Which has the cryptic, from Cairns, 9th of May, 12:10 landed, A2412 Bill Miller, message received being attacked by enemy fighters, fighters beaten off and aircraft returned to Cairns, 17:02, local, second engineer wounded, A2412 unserviceable. Whereas here we have a reconnaissance by Catalina A2412. The people in this picture are not those being named in the narrative, but it's one of the best photographs of a Catalina in the whole book, and I've been sort of saving it for the end of the, 15-part narrative. Captain Sergeant C.W. Miller, Second Pilot Sergeant A. Lunnan, airborne at Cairns, 0640 hours local, to search as much as possible of the area. 11 degrees 20 minutes south, 160 degrees 31 minutes east, 09 degrees 20 minutes south, 155 degrees east, 11 degrees 11 degrees 50 minutes south, 130. Now here we go. This is the kind of thing which really makes it difficult. 11 degrees 50 minutes south, that makes sense. 1349 south. Then we have an easting, 159.29 east. Which one of these is the southern latitude line? We'll just have to figure it out with the pins, particularly Rennel Islsnd Rossel Spit. So we have Cairns, nestling in its usual place. We have Rennel Island. We have Rossel Island Sandspit. Okay, so that heavy blue line is 10 degrees south of the equator. We are looking for 11 degrees 20 minutes south, and we are looking for 160 degrees, which is that meridian, that's 165, 160 degrees 31 minutes east. So behold, Rennel Island is not only a latitude longitude, it's also a named location in the flight log, or in the unit history sheet operational record. That makes it easy. Now 0920 degrees south, 155 degrees east. Remember, the heavy blue line is 10 degrees south, so 9 degrees and 20 minutes south is, yeah, that's about right. 155 degrees east, that's the 155 degree meridian. 11 degrees 50 south, then we have 1349S. Now that's either 13 degrees 49 minutes south, which would put it somewhere along there, whereas 159 degrees 29 minutes east would be pretty much there. 11 degrees 50 minutes south, somewhere along that latitude line, and we don't have an easting, but it is right over the top of Rossel Island, and Rossel Island was mentioned in the mission briefing. So I'm going to say that is the rectangular area that they were sent out to search. And they departed Cairns at 0640 hours local, which is kind of like the best I can make out of these map references. And as I mentioned to a bloke called Scott Purdue, who runs a channel called Flywire, fairly well centres around beechcraft bonanzas, I sort of feel like I've got a whole bunch of Catalina operators, spirits, shades, ghosts, camped around my hut at the moment, giving me nudges in the right directions every time I come across one of these map references that makes no sense. And every time I'm wondering, now, what will I read into the video next? I come up with this hunch that nudges me in the direction of something that's, oh, wow, I didn't realise that. Yes, that'll have to go in. Oh, so that's what it means. Yeah, right. So, okay, just acknowledging the shades. Alan Wharton, Jack Riddell, Bill Miller, Arthur Lunnan, and anybody else who feels like pointing me in the right direction. Thank you very much. I'll see how we get along with the rest of the video. At 12:10 hours local, a message was received stating the aircraft was being attacked by enemy aircraft in position 12 degrees 55 south, 153 degrees east. At 13:47, a further message was received requesting a doctor at the Wharf. 12:10, a message was received stating the aircraft was being attacked by enemy aircraft in position 120.55 south, 153 east. At 13:47, so I make that 1 hour and 37 minutes later, further message was received requesting doctor at Wharf, aircraft returning to base ETA 15:30 hours local. A2412 landed at Cairns 17:02 local. One member of the crew wounded and aircraft unserviceable. Sightings of shipping nil. Cairns to Cairns, flying time 10 hours 22 minutes. Golly gosh, gee darn shucks. Either it took them a long time to get their radio going after a short encounter with the enemy aircraft, and there again, we know from Murray Brown's letter that a 7,000-tonne Japanese seaplane carrier had been used to deliver float planes to Deboyne Island on the 3rd of May, as 3 of these commenced operations from there on the 4th of May. The intelligence people knew of this, but had not passed it on to us. A zero on floats would have been hard to contend with, especially with our 303s. So, at Deboyne Island, up there were 3 zero-sen fighters on floats. They'd already shot down 2 Catalinas in the past couple of days. A2418, Captain Alan Norman, shot down by Japanese during Coral Sea battle. Harry Lanahan died on the 4th of the 5th, remained a prisoner of war but killed by the Japanese on the 4th of November. A2420, Captain Gough Hemsworth, shot down by Japanese during the Coral Sea battle, no survivors. That was on the 6th of May. But it's really kind of hard to imagine a Catalina with 2 pairs of 1917 vintage Lewis guns dogging it out against 1, 2, 3 zero float planes. It doesn't actually tell me, as far as I've discovered so far, how many zeros. Was it 1? Well, it was more than 1. They said float planes. float fighters. Might have been as many as 3. I just can't see a Catalina staying alive for an hour and a half. But those are the times of the radio signals. 12:10 local time, message received stating the aircraft was being attacked by enemy aircraft. 13:47. Further message was received requesting doctor at Wharf. So now let's turn to this account and we'll see what, as it occurs, this is the one page that I need to have photocopied that I did not photocopy. So therefore I can't read from a photocopy while showing you otherwise interesting pictures taken from Jack Riddell's book. In order for me to have this up close to my face so that I can read it to you and to give you a Catalina to look at, you will have to put up with this picture of a 1950s vintage Catalina. We'll tell it's a 1950 Catalina because it's got a great big radar blob on the centre of the wing at the top of the engineer's pylon. And it also features a greatly enlarged tail fin compared to the 1942 version. Because I want to read this to you, therefore you get to look at that. And it's a little bit out of sequence, this recounting, but that's something that Jack Riddell seemed to do all the way through the book, so just roll with it, fellas, and ladies, and little children's. Bill Miller rewarded. After Bill Miller and his crew arrived at Bowen in A2412 on the 10th of May, they were sent on leave while the aircraft was repaired. This crew, Les Gordon Dunn, who was in hospital in Cairns, caught the night train out of Bowen and headed south, some to Sydney, others to Melbourne and Adelaide. So, that's Bowen there. The train trip to Brisbane suffered endless delays as priority was given to traffic going north. Southbound trains spent hours on sidings to allow this priority to operate. The normal breakfast stop finally reached by 1600 hours, so 4 o'clock in the afternoon they stopped for breakfast. The breakfast, which was probably very nice porridge at 0800 hours, had now set like concrete with about 1/8 of an inch of train soot spread evenly over the top. The crew decided to miss the meal. The dining area was in the open, on the platform, laid out on trestle tables with wooden stools, probably all obtained from the local School of Arts. At the end of this leave, all the crew met up in Sydney to travel the last leg to Bowen together. Bowen still being back up there. All were delighted that in the 2 weeks of leave, Bill Miller had been decorated with the DFM, Distinguished Flying Medal, and had also been commissioned. Bill's decoration was the first awarded to Catalina crews. Both his decoration and his commission were truly earned. On the 4th of May, A2418 was lost, and A2420 on the 6th of May while prowling around Japanese airspace. Bill Miller's airmanship saved the A2412 crew and aircraft. On 9th of May, when A2412 came under attack, Bill Miller and Jack Riddell were sitting on the bunkhead between the engineer and bunk compartment, eating a lunch of baked beans, when second pilot Arthur Lunnan sounded the klaxon alarm. Within seconds, Bill Miller was in the captain's seat. Second engineer Gordon Dunn was headed for the tail gun, which is a 303 rifle caliber, again 1917 vintage Lewis gun in this situation, which fires down a tunnel called a blast tunnel, and that blast tunnel is in the rear vertical surface of the hull. The bottom of the hull comes back to here and then it goes up, and halfway along there is this tunnel, and the tunnel points slightly down, but you can just barely fire parallel to the bottom of the hull. The whole idea is to surprise the living shit out of anybody who comes down behind a Catalina that seems to be not quite brave enough to get low down onto the waves. The fighter pilot comes down underneath the tail, thinks that they are completely shielded by the blister gunners, and the bloke in the blast tunnel gets him. The Catalinas sting in the tail. The position has no armour, nor do the blister gunners. Not sure on the back of the pilot and co-pilot's seats. But as far as I know, the Catalinas are unarmoured, and I don't think they had self-sealing fuel tanks either. Neither do the Zeros, so I suppose that makes it fair's fair, eh? Love and war. Gordon Dunn was headed for the tail gun, and Jack Rennel was sliding into the engineer's seat. This was at the same time as Japanese bullets were thumping into the aircraft. Bill Miller did everything right. His first action was to jettison the bomb load. A2412, some 4,000 pounds lighter, almost 2 tonnes, lifted into the air and handled like a fighter plane. The wing on that thing handled like a fighter plane. 150 feet span or something, 120 foot. It was a big wing. A short conversation between engineer and captain put all engineer controls into emergency settings. The engineer then set about his task of preparing the dinghy and emergency rations for ditching. To his horror, the dinghy, which was stowed under the lower port bunk, had been perforated through every fold by bullets, so the ditching option no longer existed. Do you notice how firmly Jack Rennel has wedged himself in speaking about himself in the third person? He was the engineer. He doesn't say, I did this, I did that, I did the other thing. The engineer. A quick message to the captain made him aware of the situation. Seated up inside that pylon there, with a window looking out to the side there on either side, and I think a little porthole at the front perhaps. Maybe it was just a skylight to let the daylight in. Bill's evasive techniques and the fierce defence put up by our gunners finally discouraged the Japanese float planes, and they broke off the action. During the action, Gordon Dunn had the top shot off a finger on his left hand and a bullet wound in the upper left arm. Arthur Sandell, Navigator, assisted him out of the tunnel gun position and took over his gun. After the action, Gordon Dunn was bandaged and put off to sleep on the lower port bunk with an injection of morphine from the aircraft's first aid kit, and finally finished the day in Cairns Hospital. The Navigator handed a signal to Bill Miller, advising a Japanese carrier was nearby, ordering him to search, locate, and report. He was not impressed, and was in fact very relieved when asking the Navigator for the new course for the search. Arthur Sandell admitted it was a fake signal, only a joke. Funny bugger, eh? Damage to A2412 consisted of 92 bullet holes, many below the waterline, which were repaired by the engineer prior to landing. The rudder cable had a bullet nick, so caution was necessary when using the rudder. Planning on reading Lindsay Rundle's letter in full in another video. However, we've got this final sentence at the bottom end of his letter, which sheds a bit of light on today's activities. On arrival back in Cairns with ambulances waiting, causing the locals to realise the action couldn't be too far away, not to mention the train journey from Bowen to Sydney. Yes, I can imagine that would have stirred the locals up a bit. For the locals in Cairns, watching the young blokes fly off into the wild blue yonder in the morning at dawn, coming back an hour and a half late and arriving with 92 bullet holes after having had a fight with Japanese Zeros on floats. Yeah, that would have stirred up the local yokels at Cairns quite significantly. So it would. Right. So now it's time for the piracy. This is World War II channel, hosted by Indiana Nidell. I'm subscribed to them and I've switched the bell on, so I think you probably should do so too. Okay, let's see how we go with it.
battle between aircraft carriers. This week, it does. This week comes the first major naval battle fought without the main bodies of the opposing forces having visual contact. The Battle of the Coral Sea. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, Burma fell to the Japanese, but the Allies sent naval forces towards Madagascar and New Guinea to try and prevent yet more territory from massive empire. And the Allies have been reading more and more of the Japanese radio traffic, and they crack more and more of their naval operations code. So they know the details of Admiral Shigeyoshi Inouye's Port Moresby operation, codenamed MO, which is to happen this week. Unknown to the Japanese, their whole plan was laid bare during the first 3 days of May. A map of the Coral Sea had been laid out on the makeshift operational plot at SINCPAC headquarters in Pearl Harbor, overlaid with tracing paper and pinned to a sheet of plywood resting on 2 sawhorses. The staff marked in orange pencil lines the progress of the enemy naval forces. Heading south from Truk were the twin orange lines of Admiral Takagi's 2 carriers and Admiral Goto's heavy cruiser squadron. The predicted course of the Port Moresby invasion force wound out from Rabaul through the Louisiade Passage to the tip of Papua. Blue pencil indicated the converging American units. Heading west from Hawaii, but still 2,500 miles away, was Admiral Halsey's 2-carrier task force. Some 250 miles west of the New Hebrides was the track plotted for Admiral Fitch's Lexington to join up with the Yorktown under Admiral Fletcher to become Combined Task Force 17. Steaming up from the east were the 2 cruisers of Admiral Crace's force, to be reinforced by the heavy cruisers Chicago and Perkins, dispatched from Hawaii. Admiral Inouye had no advance warning as Operation MO began that it had attracted such a great concentration of Allied firepower, now bearing down on the Coral Sea in an all-out bid to block Japan's southward advance. On the 3rd, the Japanese landed Tulagi and Florida Island, but their precise timetable is already showing strange. Takagi's carrier force is supposed to give air cover to the invasion force, but bad weather means they're 800 kilometers to the north. Fletcher gets word of the landings, so by the next morning, he's brought Yorktown like 150 kilometers south of Guadalcanal, and its planes attack the Japanese forces off Tulagi. They sink a few ships, so they're not really that effective. Yorktown then heads away south. Takagi gets word of all of this and heads to the area, but finds no enemy. On the morning of the 5th, the 3 Allied task forces meet up. On the 6th, they merge into Task Force 17. Intelligence says the Port Moresby invasion force, with the 2 fleet carriers, will head through the Louisiades the 7th, so Fletcher refuels them and plans an ambush. 10 a.m. on the 6th, however, Task Force 17 is spotted by a Japanese recon plane. Though the Allies are unaware of this, Inouye is shocked to learn that there is not 1, but 2 enemy carriers planning to intercept his invasion fleet. But Takagi, who's refueling like 600 kilometers north of Fletcher, is not in a position to engage them with an airstrike, being at maximum range and with overcast weather that would make spotting the enemy difficult. So he sends the carriers with 2 destroyers south under Chuichihara so they can attack at first light 7th. But Fletcher sends the oiler Neosho south with the destroyer Sims to wait in the rear, and then he heads northwest towards the Louisiades to block the Jomard Channel. Neither side realizes that at around 8 p.m., their carrier forces are only like 130 kilometers from each other. The morning of the 7th, Hara's scout planes are searching for the enemy in the south and report a carrier and a cruiser at 7:30 a.m. He orders a full airstrike from Shokaku and Zuikaku. Thing is, when they arrive, they find out what is reported as a carrier is the oiler Neosho, and the cruiser is the destroyer Sims. So they fly away to search for the real targets, but finding none, return and sink Sims and set Neosho on fire. She will be sunk, scuttled, in a few days' time. The Japanese lose 6 planes on this goose chase, though, but the same thing happens to Fletcher. A patrol from Lexington reports sighting 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers. So he orders a full airstrike, which heads off. But when the recon pilot arrives home, it turns out it's just 2 light cruisers and 2 gunboats, and a coding error had turned it into a megaforce. During that time, Japanese spotters have actually picked up the task force. Admiral Goto is with the transport convoy to the north, where land-based planes from Rabaul can protect them. But Shoho is ordered to immediately send an airstrike. Shoho is only 150 kilometers or so away from Fletcher's ships, but weather and just plain old luck save Fletcher from getting caught by Shoho's planes, while most of his own are away. At 11 a.m., though, Lexington's air group spots Shoho through a break in the clouds and makes a run for her. Torpedo bombers fail to score any hits, but Shoho then turns into the wind to try to launch some fighters for defense. This makes her an easy target for the arriving dive bombers from Lexington and torpedo bombers from Yorktown. 93 planes in total attack Shoho, and the outcome is absolutely never in doubt. On fire, with no pumps and no power, Shoho sinks. Japan has lost its first major warship of the war, along with some 700 of the crew of 900. At 11:36, Yorktown receives the message from Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, who commands a dive bomber squadron from Lexington. Scratch 1 flat top. Dixon to carrier. Scratch 1 flat top. Crace's task force is meanwhile under attack by land-based Japanese bombers off Deboyne Island, but only takes superficial damage. They are super surprised, however, when after fighting off the Japanese, they are then attacked by 3 American B-26 bombers. Though American command will deny that such an error could be made, but they take no damage from them either. The Japanese transports have turned back to Rabaul to await the outcome of everything. And the confused and confusing actions of this day, the 7th, show both sides committing a bunch of errors, but the Japanese paying more for them. The day even ends with one. Japanese planes that fly close enough to Task Force 17 to be within radar distance are engaged by Wildcat fighters, and some of them try to land on Yorktown, thinking it's one of their own carriers. They are quickly shown their error. Neither side attacks at night, and both expect a decisive clash between carriers. The 8th will decide the battle. Man, imagine being on one of those ships on either side that night. This impending first clash between 2 opposing naval air groups would be an almost equal contest. The advantage would go to the airstrike that managed to take its opponent by surprise. Now, for the first time, instead of guns, aircraft were the means of delivering missiles, and although the range between the opposing fleets was measured in hundreds rather than tens of miles, the outcome would be decided on the same fundamental principle. In the morning, both sides send scouting planes off at dawn, and as fate would have it, both sides sight their targets at about the same time, just after 8:15. Both sides launch full airstrikes. Just before 11:15, American planes reach Shokaku and Zuikaku, some 13 kilometers apart, screened by heavy cruisers and destroyers. The Yorktown air group forms up its attack. Shokaku launches fighters, and Zuikaku makes for the cover of a squall of rain. Unlike the attack on Shoho, the Americans do not have the same weight of numbers here against Shokaku, nor do they have practice coordinating a dive bomb and torpedo bomb assault against an active and well-defended enemy carrier. But who does? Their attack costs them 43 planes, like a third of the total force. But they've started a fire on Shokaku's deck, so she can't use it for 90 minutes or so until it's put out. She is not hit below the waterline and heads away to the northwest. Thing is, the Japanese have been pretty darn effective themselves at pretty much exactly the same time. Lexington is hit by torpedoes both port and starboard, with dive bombers to follow. Yorktown takes a 600-pound bomb through the flight deck. The whole Japanese operation takes 15 minutes or so, but they depart, reporting that they have avenged Shoho, sinking 1 large and 1 medium carrier. See, the Japanese, think that they sank Lexington already back in February. So they think the ships here are Saratoga and either Enterprise or Yorktown. But they do believe they sunk both of them, which they have not yet. The attack forces reached their own carriers between 12:50 and 2:30 p.m. The returning Americans report damaging one carrier. The other one got away unharmed. Howard tells Takagi he has only 36 operational planes left, and some of his destroyers are at 20% fuel. He says he can no longer provide air cover for the invasion, so Inoue recalls the invasion convoy to Rabaul along with Zuikaku and its escorts, postpones the operation until July 3rd, and sends Shokaku to Japan. Fletcher wants to get the hell out of Dodge because both of his carriers are hurt. So that's it. No. Aboard Lexington at 12:47, an explosion starts a fire. Two further explosions send it out of control, and the crew begins abandoning ship around 5 p.m. Destroyer Phelps sinks carrier Lexington with torpedoes at 9:15, then rejoins the task force, which is withdrawing to the southwest. That night, Combined Fleet Commander Isoroku Yamamoto tells Inoue to turn around and damn well destroy the rest of the Allied force. But after spending most of the night refueling, Takagi's ships no longer have anything to find and destroy. The Allied task force has left the building. But even as that is happening, the green light and the preparations for the next Japanese masterstroke are in progress. Now on the 5th, Japanese Imperial Headquarters issues Navy Order Number 18, which directs Yamamoto to occupy Midway Island and some of the Aleutian Islands together with the Imperial Japanese Army. I've talked about this plan before. The current Japanese naval superiority over the U.S. in the Pacific is pretty heavy. Even after the loss of Shoho and the damage to Shokaku, they still have the carrier advantage 9-3 and the operational battleship advantage 11-0. So the Japanese intend to create an Eastern Shield, while it seems to be a fairly effortless thing to do. They also know that the U.S. passed the Two-Ocean Navy Bill back in December and has 15 battleships and 11 carriers currently under construction. So the day is inevitably approaching when the Americans can launch overwhelming operations in the Western Pacific. The general plan at the moment is an attack towards the Aleutian Islands, followed by an assault on Midway. When the U.S. Pacific Fleet responds to that assault, another Japanese force, a hidden one commanded directly by Yamamoto, will attack and destroy the Americans, eliminating the U.S. Pacific Fleet for at least a year and giving the Japanese a base that is a direct threat to Hawaii, and that together with Wake and Marcus Islands can give plenty of warning of any future incoming threat. The Japanese have been running a 4-day series of war games to test the battle plans and extensive communications exercises. The war games come to an end now on the 5th, and the Navy orders issued. The operation itself, we'll talk more about next week. 2 major Allied holdouts in the struggle for the Philippines. On the 6th, American General Jonathan Wainwright surrenders Corregidor and some 11,000 men to Masaharu Homa. On the 7th, Wainwright broadcasts the surrender of Corregidor from Luzon and suggests all other U.S. forces on the Philippines do the same. This campaign has been a real problem for the Japanese. General Homa was given 50 days to take the Philippines, and it's been 5 months. One real sticking point for the Japanese is the loyalty of the Filipino troops to the U.S. They did not expect that. Tomorrow on the 10th, General William Sharp, who commands the remaining American forces there, will give the order to surrender. And in Burma, they might not be surrenders, but 2 remarkable retreats are in progress. On the 5th, after traveling 160 kilometers, fighting rearguard actions the whole way, Bill Slim's Burma Corps must now spend the rest of the week ferrying troops and refugees across the Chitwan River before they can go further, as the Nepalese Gurkhas hold off the Japanese vanguard. This they managed to do. Just. And also on the 5th, Joe Stilwell realizes he needs to head his men for India and not China, since the Japanese are further north on the Irrawaddy River than he figured. They have in fact even entered China via the Burma Road. So his crew sets out on foot from Indal the 6th, 114 men strong, with 11 jeeps to carry supplies. His final radio message reads, "Catastrophe quite possible." On the 7th, the jeeps are abandoned, and Stilwell sets a march with 205 beats per minute, 50 minutes per hour, 10 minutes of rest. There is a new offensive on land this week over in the Soviet Union at Madagascar, the end of action in the Philippines, 2 retreats in Burma, and the first ever carrier versus carrier battle. Well, enemy carrier planes versus enemy carriers. That's about the closest you come to actual carrier-on-carrier combat, since they're not designed for offense. And the Japanese win a tactical victory, but the Allies win a strategic one, for the Japanese assault at Port Moresby has been postponed. And strategic victories are not something we have seen anyone really get over the Japanese so far. And the American carrier pilots now have some real combat experience, and they did not perform markedly worse than their enemy counterparts. The general situation still hasn't changed, of course, but with the retreats in Burma and the surrender at Corregidor, this is at least a single note of optimism. And I'll bet a lot of people are thinking right now, scratch one flat top.
There you go, you see. That's why potato can piracy is sometimes worth doing, even though it gives you a bit of a blurry view. A blurry view of the Great War in real-time channels coverage of the Battle of the Coral Sea is actually clearer and easier to understand than the best I can do by videoing old maps. Now, to make it just a little bit less obnoxious from a copyright point of view, I'd like to stress that I've used this pirated footage to correct myself on the 29th of April when I was reading from Jack Riddell's book. I mentioned that on May the 7th, Admiral Crace was bombed from high level by some 19 heavy bombers, which were American planes based in Australia, and I had suggested that they were B-17s, because I know there were B-17s in Australia that were flying over the Owen Stanleys to have a hack at Rabaul. Whereas today, Indy Nidell tells me that it wasn't 19 heavy bombers at high altitude, it was 3. And they were B-26 Martin Marauders, which came out to the Pacific and didn't last very long because of the high density altitudes. And their relatively small wings and relatively high weights, and thus relatively high wing loadings, meant they were actually called the flying prostitute because they had no visible means of support. And they were also particularly nasty in single engine failure on takeoff. You had to shut the other engine down and land straight ahead no matter what it was, because if you tried full power on one engine at low speed while climbing, particularly when you're dirty with the gear hanging down, you just roll upside down and dive inverted into the ground. So yeah, one engine fails, shut the other one down and crash straight ahead. So on the one hand, my extensive use of potato can piracy of Indy Nidell has corrected an error in my video. On the other hand, I'd like to point out that at no time has he mentioned that Admiral Crace is Australian. I think they once glossed over the fact that his 2 cruisers were Australian, supported by American destroyers. I think there might have been some American cruisers too. But yeah, there was Admiral Crace was the Australian side of the Battle of the Coral Sea, and he got bombed by the Americans in Australia, operating from Australia. So at this point, that's where we're at. Well. I heard the grinding of what I thought were kangaroo teeth. So I came out with some bread. But we have a yellow-tailed black cockatoo instead. These are the largest native birds, or any kind of birds, which come to visit me. Plenty of them fellas. But as a time expired aeroplanologist, I really do like talking to the birdies. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Not a Catalina perhaps, but it's big and it's Australian and it's native and it lives in the forest and it flies. Once again, ciao.